Yo, come here, Switch to the video. Hey, everybody, what's up? Welcome back to the Game Series today, and only today, we are here to talk about Sonic and Nintendo Switch, how the relationship can improve, what games we could see updates for, what potential re-releases, remasters, ports we could get on the console, because let's face it, right? As much as Sonic is a third-party franchise, at this point, it always shows up on every platform, I do think there is actually a history of Sonic games that, one, have now only been on Nintendo consoles, and two, right, that have, not gotten the best sort of, quality specifically on Nintendo Switch. Now, again, like I said, Sonic, I think, is always going to be an IP now that releases their games on all platforms, but there are ways you can still make Sonic better, specifically on Nintendo Switch, especially considering that, like, Sega clearly wants to do that. They re-release Sonic X Shadow Generations and Crossroads for Switch 2 with, Switch 2 editions, with upgrades and everything, so they want the IP to grow on it, and it's obviously, here's the thing. Sonic, at the end of the day, meshes incredibly well with Nintendo, right? Whether Nintendo wants that or not, like, it kind of just works, right? You have, a cute mascot platformer, basically. You have, the games are effectively mainly platformers, which, if you're playing a Nintendo Switch, you're probably into that genre of game, right? They've had, like I said, a long-standing history. I feel like most people that like Mario, to an extent, like Sonic, I'm not saying, it's everybody, but, most Sonic fans, I would say, like, probably own a Nintendo console, or a lot of them do. It's very rare I've seen a Sonic fan be like, yeah, I don't really like Mario or Nintendo that much. Maybe, it exists, but it's not that common, right? So let's talk about all the ways that they can change this, make things better for the platform, because I do feel like over the almost decade now of Nintendo Switch, Sonic has not been, treated the best on the Switch platform. Now let's talk about, the big one, the elephant in the room, Sonic Frontiers, right? Sonic Frontiers was the latest and greatest Sonic game to release on the Switch, but if you can look at the footage here, the Switch version of the game wasn't really the best. Like, we're talking low resolutions, frame rate being, pretty choppy. Now, I'm actually shocked the game, even runs well, when you get to, like, the super bosses that are in the game, like the Super Sonic bosses and everything. Like, I'm shocked the game can even exist, but, especially when the game is raining, it looks, very bad. Like, I think that is, what is being discussed and talked about for Sonic Frontiers, and that is the Sonic Frontiers Definitive Edition leak going around. And now, if anything, actually, as of the recording of this video, another website leaked this. You can check it on Tails channel, where it was a website called So Gamely that also leaked it again. But now the leak is specifically saying that it is a, Sonic Frontiers for Switch 2, which to me, it starts to tell me that, all right, maybe there's going to be a big re-release for Switch 2 because the original version wasn't great at all. And maybe it'll be a free patch on the other consoles for people that want, downloadable content or whatever. But regardless, I do think, that is the number one thing to actually work on and re-release, because that game, is massive. And I do think trying to up the sales of Sonic Frontiers on Switch makes a lot of sense by, re-bringing some life back into it, making it 60 FPS. Because, like, I would love to sit down and play Sonic Frontiers in handheld mode. I've never gotten that experience. I know people will say, get a Steam Deck, but I don't want to get a Steam Deck. I don't really care for that. But I have a Switch, and I would love to play that game on my Switch in handheld, no compromise. Give me a nice, on the TV 1440p 60 FPS or whatever the 2K resolution is, and in handheld, give me a crisp 1080 60. I'm good. I'll take that. I'll be happy. Now, the platforming games, honestly, the 2D ones, I would mainly leave alone. Like, I don't really think there's anything you could do for Sonic Mania or even Sonic Origins. I think those games are fine on the platform, but I could see some sort of upgrade for Sonic Superstars on Switch 2, right? Because if you look at Sonic, Superstars on Switch 1 versus, like, PlayStation, it does have a little bit of a lower resolution, has a bit more, longer load times, but for the most part, it is still, 60 FPS. It looks great and everything. So I maybe don't need a Switch 2 version of Superstars, but I could go with, a slight patch just to up the resolution, maybe make it like 1440p, make it look really good on your big TV. But again, that's really nothing much you could do with that. And then there's the two other 3D platformers that I don't think they're ever going to touch, because for Sonic Colors Ultimate, I do think, Blind Squirrel or whatever that team is done, so they're not going to be touching that game unless, Sonic team internally says, hey, we'd like to update this. Because insanely enough, Sonic Colors, a Wii game, by the way, right, on Switch, is in 30 FPS, bro. 30 FPS and really bad loading screens. Now, granted, when you play it on Switch 2, it loads like a little bit faster, but you know, it's still at the end of the day a bit of a weird bump. You know what I mean? We're like, okay, you're just kind of looking at a game that just looks definitely way worse than, you know, the other platforms, especially when like already the game has so many issues. When you add on top of that a low frame rate, it just kind of makes you just not want to play it on the Switch. So if they could find a way, you know, I would be really cool, but I don't think they're going to touch it. And of course, we've got Sonic Forces, which also has the same issue where it's 30 FPS, but it's Sonic Forces, and they're not going to touch that game nor update it ever again, nor do I think anyone really cares. Another game that is on the platform and doesn't really run the best is Team Sonic Racing. You know, that also has the issue of it being 30 FPS, but again, we have Crossroads on the platform. They're probably never going to touch this one, nor do they probably even care to. All right, now let's get into the fun territory of this video, though. What Sonic games would make sense to bring to the platform, right? Because, you know, at the end of the day, I do think there's a lot of Sonic games we could get on every platform, but let's talk about an easy one, right? Sonic Lost World, right? Okay, let's face it, Sonic Lost World is not my favorite game out there, nor is it most people's, I would say. But think about it this way, right? Imagine, you know, they did a Sonic Central or Sonic Direct or something, and they're like, hey, you know what? For preservation reasons, and because we have a partnership with Nintendo, we are, you know, doing a digital-only re-release of Sonic Lost World, $25, digital only. I would take that. You know, I'd be pretty happy about that. I would not feel too bad about buying a digital only copy of Sonic Lost World on, you know, Nintendo Switch. And again, like I said, because they have the partnership with Nintendo, I feel like it's something that they could get on there. Now, I know the game is on PC too, so that is, you know, a general buff for it. But yeah, I could see a Switch 2 re-release of Sonic Lost World. Again, I don't think it would be on every platform because if you face it logistically, I don't think Sonic Lost World would sell really well. You know, unless you did massive overhauls to the game, new worlds, sort of like a Silver X Sonic Lost World, like a lot of people, you know, rumor and hope for. But unless you did like a complete rewrite, you changed the story, you changed the Deadly Six, at that point, just make a new game. But I would be down for a digital, you know, $20, $25 version of the game. Again, it's not my favorite game. It's kind of like an okay thing that exists, but you know, preservation reasons and the fact that they worked for Nintendo makes that an easy re-release. All right, now this is something that is an interesting topic, right? And that is Sonic Unleashed. Now, I do think Sonic Unleashed is, if they ever re-release it, I would love obviously to see all versions of the game, you know, on all platforms. But if people remember this, the Wii and PS2 versions of Sonic Unleashed were completely different, right? They, you know, they had some missing different levels. In fact, I grew up with the Wii version of Sonic Unleashed. It actually worked completely different. The boost worked in like bursts where you had like a certain amount of boost and you had to like gather, you know, boost meters to use it. Some of the level layouts were completely different. The way the Werehog levels worked were very different. Like, it is a completely different experience on the Wii and PS2. So if they ever did a re-release of the game, I would love if, like, just for preservation's sake, they brought back the Wii versions of the level. Again, I know they're not the most like grandiose or great to showcase, but just in terms of like, you know, preservation standpoint, I feel like I would love to see those levels in some way brought back if they were ever to do an Unleash, a re-release, you know, for Nintendo Switch. Now, it's funny, the Wii back in the day had two Sonic exclusives that are in such a weird place, and that is Sonic and the Secret Rings and Sonic and the Black Knight. These games heavily relied on the Wii remote, you know, because Black Knight, you were waggling to, you know, get your combos in. With Sonic and the Secret Rings, you effectively, the entire game was on a sideways Wii remote, right? Now, I think these games are probably, I'm not gonna lie to you, never seeing the light of day ever again. I think the only way you would ever see these games ever is if Sega completely remade them, right? But if you're thinking, you know, ever if they're gonna re-release these, it's just not gonna happen. You know, they're games that critically did not do great at all. You know, they bombed. Especially, Sonic and Secret Rings like reviewed somewhat well. I'm sure they still sold a decent amount of copies, but you know, they're not favored in the public eye, right? So if they ever did release them, they'd probably, you know, have to completely remake and redo these games. But it would be really cool if, you know, they did that and they did work on that. All right, now Sega, Sonic, Nintendo. Let me tell you something. All right. On Nintendo Switch, there are virtual consoles, right? You've got Nintendo Switch Online, and we've got two notable platforms for Switch Online that Sonic could and should show up for. All right, so let's start with the first one, GameCube. Right, if people, you know, we talk about a lot here, nostalgia. GameCube is home for Sonic. You know, I mean, a lot of my early love for Sonic came from the GameCube. Sonic Adventure DX, right? Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, Sonic Riders, Sonic Mega Collection, right? Like, these were really pivotal games for Sonic that were available on the GameCube, right? And I do feel like if Sega, right, is not going to invest, right, in remasters of, you know, these games, right? Because I don't think Sonic Riders is getting a remaster ever, because they'd probably just make a new one or remake it. At least have them on GameCube NSO. You know, that would be such a cool bonus feature if they were just to be like, you know what? Hey, we're not planning on remaking the adventure game. Oh, no, we're planning on remaking the adventure games one day. But until then, you know, here's at least this, right? Where you have access to Sonic Adventure 1, 2, and Riders bare minimum on GameCube NSO, you know, and make it a big deal, right? Because, you know, Sega has worked with Nintendo on virtual console before. I mean, look at the, what's it called? We have a whole Genesis app for Nintendo Switch Online that you get when you're subscribed to NSO. Like, that is a big deal. That means Sonic and Nintendo are, you know, in not cahoots. That's a crazy way to say it, but yeah, I mean, they are in bed together. They're laying down together. Listen, Nintendo and Sega are laying down together, but they don't want to have fun. It's just like they just kind of feel like a married couple, but like they're like really bored of each other, right? I need y'all to spice up to get crazy. All right, put those games on there. And of course, how can we talk about, you know, virtual console slash Nintendo, you know, Sonic games without talking about the Sonic Advance games? Now, Sonic Advance, I know, has a weird issue because they used to be published by THQ. THQ is no longer around, but they exist as THQ Nordic, as a different company completely. Like, it's weird what happened with THQ and its IPs, right? But on the Wii U, they were able to re-release Sonic Advance in Japan specifically, not in North America. They, in some way, have access to the Sonic Advance games, at the very least, you know, the first one. So I do think that would be a sick anniversary moment where, okay, again, at the bare minimum, if Sega does not want to invest in a remaster collection, or if, you know, that's not what they're working on, I would love to see the Sonic Advance games dropped on Nintendo Switch Online. It's just like, it's just one of those things that, like, it's a match made in heaven, you know? And maybe, you know, Sega does want to remaster the Advance games because, yeah, they have. The good thing about Sonic Team and Sega is because they've now released Sonic Origins, there's kind of no way to resell you Sonic 1, 2, 3, and CD again unless they completely remake them. Like, that's the only way they can really resell those games, because now you have a sort of definitive way to access those games on modern platforms. I felt like for a long time they were constantly banking on what are ways we can resell these original games, but I feel like now they're kind of stuck. Now it's kind of like, hey, these are the ones that are available here, right? So I do think that, you know, with the advanced case, people want re-releases of them. But again, if they're not going to go through the effort of doing that, then hey, man, just how about we lock in a little bit and give that to Nintendo, please? Another idea that I've floated around for a while, and this one might be controversial, right? Because, and also, by the way, I forgot to mention Heroes. Heroes is another massive game that, again, we've heard rumors for a long time of it being remade, but it would also be fun to see on Nintendo Switch Online. But as I was saying, right? Another idea that might be controversial, because I do think this platform is a lot more big and renowned than people, you know, think it is. That's the Dreamcast. What if, right, Nintendo and Sega locked in together, right, and they're like, hey, we are working in collaboration with Nintendo to, you know, introduce Dreamcast Online, right? That would be massive. I mean, that would be huge, right? Dreamcast games, a lot of them actually got delisted from Steam about a year ago, which started a lot of fan speculation about what they potentially might do with, you know, the Dreamcast, right? If Sega's planning their own, you know, streaming service of Sega games, if they're going to be re-releasing a collection of something. But it does feel like, regardless, Sega is planning, you know, stuff around the Dreamcast. So, because you think about it, they're making that Crazy Taxi revival, they're making a Jet Set revival, right? They just revived Shinobi. Like, there's a lot of their IPs that they're bringing back from that era. But hey man, if you're not gonna do, if you're not gonna invest in a remaster collection, I would love to see Nintendo and Sega work together, sell a Dreamcast Online where you're constantly updating games. That way you get access to Adventure 1. I believe Adventure 2 is one of like the last games available on the Dreamcast as well. So they could have those games in there. They could have your Crazy Taxis, your Jet Sets, everything. Obviously I'm going past Sonic right now. But yeah, I do feel like that's another way they can spice the Nintendo and Sega relationship. Because like they haven't updated the Sega Genesis online app for Nintendo Switch in a while. But again, the fact that that even exists is still a big deal, because that doesn't mean like Nintendo and Sega are like talking, you know what I mean? And they're talking a lot, bro. They're yapping it up. Now, another platform that Sonic was very prolific in was the DS, right? Obviously, we had Sonic Rush, we had Sonic Rush Adventure, we had, what was it? Sonic Colors DS, right? We had Sonic Chronicles, for better or worse, depending on who you ask. And so Sonic did have a decent output on the Nintendo DS, but obviously the most notable three would be, the Rush trilogy, as people call it, with Sonic Colors DS, because it is kind of like a third Rush game, sadly, as much as I hate to admit it. But yeah, I do think that's an interesting one, because the Rush games are kind of, I feel, in my opinion, they are kind of screwed unless they completely remade them, because the way Rush games are designed with like the two screens, like you have to platform from one screen to another. It's not one of those DS games that like uses one screen as a menu and the other as a game. You kind of do like platform between both of the screens of the game. In fact, and even you have the special stages that involve like tapping on the bottom, moving left and right with the stick, flicking left to right, up, down. So there's a lot of weird logistics about how they could do a Sonic Rush, collection. Now, granted, they could probably go in the game and maybe reconfigure, reprogram some stuff. But if Nintendo was ever to do a Nintendo DS NSO, that's a place I would love to see the Sonic Rush games appear again, if Sega does not want to invest the money into potential remakes, remaster. Because again, you can, in my opinion, you can really only remake the Sonic Rush games if you're not just gonna re-release them in some weird way with like a Switch version where maybe it's like vertical that you can touch the bottom screen on. I don't know how they would do it. Let me know if you got any ideas in the comment section below, but that's another big one that I'd love to see. Now, there are two modern Sonic games that people often talk about, but not too much, and I feel like would be perfect fits for Nintendo Switch. First one being Sonic Dream Team, right? Sonic Dream Team came out on Apple, exclusively about 2 to 3 years ago now. It's getting old in how long that game's existed for. So that game is one that, people have seen on iPhone for a while, but people really, really like that game, including myself. And they've updated it with costumes. It's got a great art style. It's, a fun, simple game, but it's been locked on Apple Arcade for a long time. But I do think, right, once maybe a year more or two has passed, that maybe they could get, their hands on it. I know Apple funded it, which is the reason it even exists and why it's exclusive to it, but that's a game that I feel like is perfect for a Switch-only release. You know what I mean? If they didn't want to invest in multi-platform because it feels like a small-scale game, I would love a digital-only Switch release of Dream Team. I feel like it would just work incredibly well for that platform. And again, it's very simple. It's like 2-button type of game. You have all the team mechanics. That game is updated so much over the last 2 years. Like, you can unlock music, you have achievements, every level has rankings now. Again, you have costumes, you have new levels based on Shadow and a few characters. So like, they've really invested a lot in the game, and I would love that game to be re-released. But I do think like on Switch, I do feel like the game would be at home. And the second one, and I'm sure this has been discussed a lot, I feel like the way you save Sonic Rumble is you put it on Switch, right? I think Sonic Rumble is a game that, they're still trying to update, put, characters in. They actually just, announced that they're doing a Sonic and the Secret Rings update, so they're still trying with that game, right? But hey man, I feel like, the team is losing out on big money by not having that game be a Switch free-to-play game as well. I feel like it would do so well on the Switch. If you sold the game on Switch, people had proper button controls to playing that game in handheld, for short burst rounds, right? Playing it on the TV, up to resolution, maybe like cleaning the HUD a little bit when you're playing it on TV. I feel like That's how you save Sonic Rumble Party, man. I don't think it needs to be on every platform. Obviously, I think optimally it should be on every platform. That way we get the most players on the game and, you know, more people can have access to it. But I feel like that is like the perfect small scale Sonic game that if you were to have it on a platform, I feel like the platform you would go with would be the Nintendo Switch. Another one, by the way, that I'm shocked has never gotten a, you know, free like download on Switch or anything is Murder of Sonic, right? The Murder of Sonic, if you guys remember, was a Steam only release, you know, of Sonic. But it's crazy that that's a game that's like really great, like has a really great story and some really cute moments. And if you don't own a PC, I know granted it's a visual novel, anyone with a potato could run the game, but it is kind of weird that like other people don't have access to it. I mean, a lot of people love visual novels. So that game, even just being a free download on Switch, if they wanted to just do that, would be like perfect. That's like a game that I'm shocked never made its way to consoles maybe like a year later, right? I feel like there's missed potential going on over there, but maybe they'll work on a sequel for it, because I feel like knowing how that game was made, where it was, you know, the social media team and a few others that worked on the concept of it to release it, I would love to see it released on platforms, but again, maybe there's a weird marketing that would go on with that. Maybe I feel like a Steam release makes it more low profile than it needs to be. I don't know, but regardless, maybe they don't want people on their Switch to look at the Murder of Sonic and then be like, oh my god, Sonic is dead, but I thought that would happen. All right, now like I said, Sonic is most likely an IP that is going to be third party, but if Sega and Nintendo were to work together again, right, in some capacity, there are a few, you know, game types I would like to see. Now, the number one and easy one is Fidel. What's happening with Mario and Sonic at the Olympics? That was a partnership. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get re-releases of those games. In fact, if anything, we're getting de-releases of those games. They just recently delisted Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Tokyo games from the eShop. So you cannot download that game. So reminder, that game is not available digitally. So if you're like, wait, shit, I did not know that, go buy a physical copy if you can, while they're still cheap and while they're still around, because yeah, that game does not exist anymore. So I think that is dead for the most part. Right now, what could Sonic and Nintendo do in the future? Obviously, a lot of people have thrown many ideas. The elusive Sonic and Mario platformer, but I do feel like that's not gonna happen anytime soon, because again, they are so much more competitive now. If anything, I find the fact that Sonic and Mario are now box office competitors, I feel like that makes the likelihood of them platforming, like of them you know, working together, doing stuff together, I feel like that significantly worsens the relationship. You know, there's something about movies and Hollywood I feel like are such a different beast, where like you don't really see like cross media crossovers in movie. You know, you don't really see like Warner Bros IPs mixed with Disney IPs, or like Paramount IPs mixed with, you know, other, you know, Pixar, whatever. I'm so bad with movie series, but like I feel like you don't ever rarely see, you know, movie companies do fusion IPs, because I feel like the movie industry is so much more like competitive and cutthroat and like protective about their IPs. So regardless, right, I do think, you know, some sort of Sonic and Nintendo partnership would be really cool. You know, people have floated around the idea that, hey, if they ever did a Sonic, or, you know, a Smash Bros movie, that Sonic could be in there. If they ever got Sonic on Mario's movies, I don't think though it would be movie Sonic. I think it would be like, you know, game Sonic. They'd bring in like classic Sonic in there as a bit, right, or something, but I don't think it would be movie Sonic. I think they would treat it as its own thing. A fun, simple one, you know, people have floated around for a while, is a RPG, right? Sort of think of like how Mario and Luigi RPGs are, but with Sonic characters. That would be so incredibly cool. I would love to see something like that. I would love to even maybe see like a sprite-based 2D beat 'em up. You know, in that sense, like there's a lot of ideas they can have, right? But the thing is, at the end of the day, I just feel like Sonic has this weird problem right now with its, you know, accessibility in its games, where like the way their games were released and the quality of them, you know, in a lot of ways makes it difficult to justify re-releases, right? I think, you know, Sega doesn't want to re-release a game like 06, right? Or the, you know, the storybook games, right? Or even Shadow the Hedgehog, just because of like their critical reception being so down. So I think the only way you can really bring back those old games is sort of putting them in a collection. Because I feel like when you put a game in a collection, people often don't even think about the quality of the game in the collection. They just judge the collection itself. Like, all right, well, this is a remaster of these games, or a collection of these games. I know what I'm getting into, right? There's plenty of like collections that come out nowadays that have like 3 or 4 games that you just don't care about at all. You know what I mean? So I think in that sense, right, they could get away with a lot if they just did stuff like, hey, we're dropping these games on NSO. Hey, we're doing like a little, Dreamcast X Nintendo, right? We're doing something where at least these games are accessible. But my just biggest fear as like a Sonic fan is like, is just, are there going to be generations of people that never experienced Sonic Rush because, they're DS games and they're like formatted weirdly, right? Are there people that are never going to experience the advanced games? Like, and we're getting to the point where, like, again, unless you're someone with a computer, you have not been able to access these games ever in any re-releases. At least with the adventure games, like, okay, like they're readily available on Xbox, so you can get them. They're still available on PC. Like, there's ways to still experience those, but we're getting to a point where, like, games like Heroes has never gotten a re-release despite it selling incredibly well back in the day, right? Advanced games, no re-releases. Sonic Rush games, no re-releases. Again, the Sonic Storybook games, as much as I don't really, I understand why people don't like them, critics-wise, those games have been gone for almost 20 years. So it is definitely an issue that Sonic and Sega team, I really do think, need to fix and figure out, because I feel like preservation is important for games. Preservation is important for, Sega's history, right, of the IP. And so, yeah, I would love, more output of Sonic games for, Nintendo especially, because they do have a relationship of the past. They've worked together. And like I said, I do know that I don't actually know personally. I just mean, like, I do feel, right, there's a feeling that, like, Nintendo doesn't want to hype up Sonic too much, but I don't also think that's very true, because Shadow Generations did launch, a Switch 2 edition of that game did launch day one on Switch. Yakuza Director's Cut was a big deal to be a Switch 2 release, right? They did re-release Puyo Puyo Tetris on Switch 2 day one. They're selling Crossroads Switch 2 editions, and again, we're clearly getting a Frontiers Definitive Edition at some point. So I do think that Sega and Nintendo do actually talk a lot and have a good relationship. I just would love to see that love and care extend to, the sub-series of Sonic that have disappeared for a while. Now, there's even games I miss, like, the Sonic 4 games, as much as people don't like them. I feel like at least Sonic 4 Episode 2 deserves, to be in the spotlight, right? I'm sure there's a bunch of other games I missed. Sonic Rivals games are locked behind the PSP, and so are they ever going to re-release those games, or are those games done forever? Like, Sonic Boom, now granted, we can leave that in the dust. It's one I didn't mention. But yeah, no, it's a tough topic, and please, obviously, in the comment section below, let me know what you guys think. There's even like a whole backlog of old games. Would Sonic 3D Blast ever see the light of day again? I don't know. But regardless, guys, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching today's video. What Sonic games would you like to see updated on Switch 2, re-release, played, and everything? I love you guys. Thank you all for watching. And of course, I'll see you all next time. Peace out.